Okay, hello, welcome to episode 90 of the Online Tennis Podcast. Today I'm joined by John, a sleepless John, to discuss the Madrid Masters, Carlos Alcaraz's win over Jan-Lennard Struff in the final there. John, how you doing?
Yeah, I got a couple of hours in on the plane, but Sleepless in Bonn doesn't quite have the same ring to Sleepless in Seattle, so let's avoid sleepless puns. But no, I'm actually doing okay.
Good to hear it, John. Yeah, the trip sounded amazing. Very keen to flesh out as much as I can of that information. It sounded like an amazing trip. I would have made it an Andy Murray podcast, but I'll give him a brief shout out just to say amazing, Andy. Well done on the Challenger win. But it is a focus on Carlitos today and his win in Madrid. And of course, Struffi's run as well, which was a really, really, really surprising finalist appearance. Obviously, I'm very, very excited to get into it. Stats on Carlos first, of course. Matches played in Spain since 2022, 24. He's won 23 of them. I lost to Oji Aliassime, if you want to count that, in the Davis Cup, of course, being the only one. 4 titles in that time, 2 in Barca, 2 in Madrid. Managed to defend both of the titles in the past few weeks. 4th title this year after the 250 in Buenos Aires, Indian Wales Masters, and the 500 in Barcelona, of course. And now 5 points separating him and Novak in the ATP rankings. Novak's still number one, but just 5 points between them. Talking a little bit about the final, because on paper, a lot of people maybe thought Jan-Lennard Struff, the world number 65 out of the top 100 a few weeks ago, could have been a pretty rubbish final. A lucky loser as well. He'd lost to Aslan Karatsev earlier in the week in qualies. But honestly, top 10 opponents like Ruud, Tsitsipas, Fritz, Oje Aliassime, I think we know how that ends in a final against Carlos. But here, this was a proper sort of wild card. Somebody who had the perfect antidote to the Carlos Alcaraz game. How did you find the final live as well, of course? John, how did you find it?
Oh, it was great. And it was great for one reason and one person, and that was Jan-Lennard Struff. I know we're in Madrid and Carlos is amazing, and Carlos may well go on to become one of the greatest tennis players of all time, and we know how spectacular he is as well. But listen, if we get away from all of that, this was kind of Struff's moment. This was Struff's day. This was Struff's 14 days. And as you touched on there, it began with a defeat, if you like. Well, I mean, he won one round in qualifying, which, by the way, his defeat in qualifying, I think was his first defeat in qualifying all year. He's just been cleaning up all year
Wow.
in
Okay.
qualifying, which I think he's pretty much had to do at most of the big tournaments. But we did get a glimpse of Struff I felt in Monte Carlo in that win over Casper Ruud. I thought he was amazing in that match. I
Of
think
course,
he had a
made the
double,
quarters there, right? Made the
yeah, and
quarterfinals there.
he had a double break advantage on Casper in the second set, and he let that go, but still managed to win the tiebreak, which is hats off to him. But the score of 6-2, 7-6, I think it was, didn't do it justice. He was just sensational. We know about Casper's troubles, but perhaps that's for a separate podcast. But yeah, so for me, this tournament, no one in that Madrid crowd would agree with me pretty much, but for me, this tournament was Jan-Lennard Struff.
Absolutely. There's a lot of people mentioned Struff as somebody who wasn't really on anybody's radar, but he's not a nobody. Like the guy, he's a giant killer is what I used to call him, 6'4", with the ability to knock out big players. 12 top 10 wins throughout his career doesn't sound like loads, but you're talking about Rublev at the French Open a couple of years ago, Medvedev and Halle, Zverev at Indian Wells. There's other players like Kachanov, Nori, Carreno Busta who don't have as many top 10 wins.
Exactly.
And Struff only emerged as a player at the age of 29, really. He didn't have a positive record on the tour up until 29 years old, which was only 2019, which is wild. He's got the 7th best upset rate of active players. So
Okay.
Nishioka first, Berankis second, Kyrgios third, Fusovic fourth, and then you eventually get to Struff at 7th. He can make big scalps against anybody. He can take the racket out of the opponent's hand, is what I should say. Massive serve, great serve and volley game, as you touched on. And why exactly did it work so well against Carlos? Well, Carlos, obviously, in an extended rally, near nobody can beat him. Backhand is world class, can't be peppered without pressure for too long. The forehand is obviously a joke and will come out on top against anybody if you trade with it. And then the drop shot is just, perfection executed, adds an unfair extra layer to all that, all those advantages I already mentioned. He's just impossible to break down in longer rallies. Struff knew that. He touched on it when he was talking to yourself, John, in the press conference. He said, if you give him time, He's just too good. So short rally offense was the name of the game, and he executed it perfectly, John.
He
Would you agree?
channeled his inner Caroline Garcia, but also his inner Maxime Cressy. He wasn't quite as set on the serve volley all the time. He did sort of mix that up a little bit, just so so he wasn't too predictable, if you like. I asked Carlos afterwards about the game plan from Jan-Lennard and whether that had taken him by surprise. Carlos said, no, it's kind of what I expected. He's he's an aggressive player. It took me a little bit by surprise, and although I wouldn't dare disagree with the new king of Spain, Carlos Alcaraz, but I think if it didn't take him by surprise, it certainly took him, I think, about 8 games to adjust. And I know he broke serve in the first game of the match, I think it was, and he took a 2-love lead. But actually, during those first 8 games, it felt like Jan-Lennard Struff was the better player. There was a backhand return pass, I think, off a second serve, and it was like, okay. It was about 4-all, maybe 4-3. And it was like, okay, I think Carlos here has got his eye now. He knows what's coming, the serve and volley, etc. As I say, it wasn't 100% of the time, but it was a lot of the time, especially in the earlier parts of the match. And it was like, okay, he's sort of adjusting his return as a result, etc. But it really wasn't probably until that third set where Carlos did just pull away from Jan-Lennard.
Yeah.
I also heard some, and this is just speaking to someone, I haven't actually had this verified, but maybe Jack, about Jan-Lennard's first serve stats being quite low. I think less than 50% in the first set, maybe even less than 50% overall. That'll probably be the one big regret, because I don't think there's much else he could do. I know he lost the match on a return of serve that went just long, that Carlos has to skip out the way of, if you like, which is quite funny. But that's what you got to do. I mean, one final thing, and then I'll let you say something, Jack, of course. But I look at it as in any sport, just about individual or team, when you've got someone who's better, if you like, who's the favorite, who's got more weapons, who's got more money to throw at it in other sports in particular, that's fine. You can just bring your A game, and that's what you rely on, if you like. If you're a lower league football team, or you're a Jan-Lennard Struff, who's obviously lower down the rankings and obviously doesn't have Carlos's pedigree, you've got to do something else, because your A game will not beat his A game. That's just a fact. And one final thing, as I was watching the match yesterday, I was thinking of Craig O'Shaughnessy and what he was lamenting Tommy Paul in the Australian Open semi-final this year on Twitter. And he was just saying, why are you doing this? Because there's Holger Rune has set out the template to how to play Novak and stuff. And although I got what Tommy Paul said in the press conference afterwards, I don't think he was directly addressing Craig, but maybe one of the journalists was indirectly passing that on. It's like, why didn't you try something different? And Tommy just said, easier said than done. I just didn't have those moments to approach the net or whatever. But I still think he could have done a bit more, been mega aggressive on the return. Once you start getting in rallies with these guys, Novak and Carlos in particular, you're dead. And Jan-Lennard had avoided that as best he could.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm going to touch on all of that you just said there, John, because there's loads of relevant stuff you said there, particularly the first serve, which was obviously a key factor throughout. But I was talking about the way that Struff was able to counter a lot of the weaknesses and strengths, I guess, in Alcaraz's game. Of course, the deep return position of Alcaraz, 5 metres behind the baseline. I thought we would see a bit of variation with that from Alcaraz, but he stayed that far back, and the serve volley was consistently a good counter to that. You were talking 75% first serve points won for Struff throughout the match. That is the second lowest first serve return rate of Alcaraz's year so far, behind Sinner at Indian Wells. So consistently that first serve was working, and very, very little that Alcaraz could do about it, because he didn't want to go out of his comfort zone. We were talking about how he felt sort of uncomfortable for 2 sets and a bit, basically. That continued, and he remained behind the baseline, so it was working. It was just when Struff's first serve kind of toed and froed that there was a little bit of weakness. But what totally took me by surprise was Struff's ability to counter Alcaraz's relatively poor service placement, which is still the area of weakness in Alcaraz's game. We saw it against Ruusuvuori. Anything in the Ruusuvuori strike zone at the start of the week was absolutely destroyed. Struff did exactly the same thing. And the lack of a reliable sliding serve in the deuce court in particular, I've talked about this with Alcaraz before, meant that anything in the deuce court that was in Struff's forehand, backhand, he's such a tall guy as well, so any of the kickers, he could attack, was glued to the baseline on the other side of the court. I mean, he was 0.15 metres behind the baseline on first serve return, 1.29 metres inside the baseline on a second serve return, very frequently putting Alcaraz in the back foot immediately. Yeah, and we saw that in the first set. There was a drop of a serve to Love that I think Struff just like glued 4 returns in a row to the baseline that Alcaraz just absolutely couldn't do anything about. Kick serves as well, of course. I was surprised at how well he was doing it. He consistently did it. And it meant in that first set, I mean, that easily could have went the way of Struff.
He had love 40. He had love 40, Jack, didn't he, at 4-5, but he didn't.
He had love 40. Exactly. And that game I was just about to talk about specifically, because there was 2 breaks of serve first from Struff, both of them featuring 2 double faults, both of them featuring very few first serves in, so just a tiny little bit more in the performance factor from Struff, and that could have went a totally different way. Struff touched on it himself. He thought that set was there for the taking, basically. But Alcaraz didn't try to play anything he didn't have. So he doesn't have a serve that he can place perfectly. So throughout the match, he went to the body. And that, I thought that's Juan Carlos Ferrero written all over that. And he went towards the sort of backhand jam of Struff, right, to the body, rather than trying to ace him outright. In conditions where the ball's fast, you would expect that to be possible, but the placement's got to be spot on. Instead, he just went straight at Struff. Love 40 down, 5-4, 3 serves, all unreturned, 2 of them straight to the body of Struff. That's not going away from that tactic and just recognising where there's a weakness in his game, not trying to hide from that, was the reason that Alcaraz only just stayed alive for 2 sets. And then when it got to the third set, after surviving umpteen's attacks, from Struff, he had that break point at the start of the third set, only just survived that. Alcaraz used the crowd. He got pumped up after that game. He came up with 2 of the most special shots he'd played the whole match, particularly the drop shot, which Struff had not allowed him to play for the entirety of the match, by the way, through consistent depth. He used a backhand drop shot at, I believe, 2-1-30 all that I did not see coming at all. That was the moment. That was the shot that was like, you always get it with an Alcaraz match. That was the moment I was like, this kid is special. Coming up with shots like that, right?
Yeah, but you do get more drop shots. Yesterday, that was notable because it's like, oh, I forgot about the drop shot. It's unusual to get to a midway point of a third set before you say that. One other thing as well on Struff is that to have that game plan is one thing, but to pull it off so exquisitely is another, which is something else that he did. Not just with the return of serves, which we've already touched upon, but his touch at the net at times was I'm going to use the word again, exquisite.
Edberg-esque sometimes, right? Some of them were just
Edberg, Somebody said that in the press conference actually.
I'm not surprised.
A very funny Spanish journalist, actually, Manu, 69 years old. He's probably watched more tennis than you and I can remember. And he made me laugh several times throughout the week. But I've got to highlight him actually because I probably won't be doing any more pods of my own on Madrid at least. So I want to touch on Manuel. So a big shout out to him because first of all, there was this. He said, "Oh, you were Edberg-esque." The day before, because I start recording, just as everyone's sort of settling down before even the first question, and he said to Sabalenka, he went, "Nice trophy." And I don't know why it just made me laugh when I was listening back to it again.
Yeah.
But the funniest thing, Jack, and he's already had a mention, and it might well be the last time he gets a mention, but Andy Murray's press conference. So he's just had a pretty bad first round defeat. And not only that, a couple of really horrible volleys on top of the net. I think Andy told one journalist, he said, "I think you would have made that. No disrespect to your tennis ability." And then when the press conference finished, Andy was coughing a bit. So this guy, this Spanish guy said, "Do you want a caramel, Andy?" And I don't know why. It's just so funny because he's like, "No, I don't want a caramel, thanks." It was just, Andy Murray's had a horrible defeat, and then he's like, "You want a caramel?"
Wetherspoon's original, why not? That's so funny. Yeah. It's got a bit of a absurdity about it. I really like it. It's funny.
It's absurd. Yeah, it's really
funny. Touching on just before the drop shot again, just wanted to talk about one more special moment because that's the highlight basically for me Alcaraz didn't play very well for basically the entirety of the match. He survived playing his sort of base level, and then he came up with something special when he needed it most. So it was like a 30-15 point as well, or was it 15-all? Struff serves to the backhand, but Alcaraz runs all the way around. You must remember this one, maybe, John. Amazing forehand pass. He needed that. He sensed it as well. The game before, huge vamos to the crowd, gets himself pumped up, getting himself pumped up after that pass. He knew that was the moment for him to sort of go ahead. Reminded me of that forehand pass on match point against De Minaur last year in Barcelona. The one he runs all the way around. You'll remember that one, John.
I vaguely remember it. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it was just insane. He should have been off balance, but he comes up with something special, and that's Alcaraz written all over it. Struff couldn't have played much better. The perfect antidote for the deep return position, phenomenal drop shotting, and middling service placement of Alcaraz. Never gave the Spaniard any rhythm. Alcaraz, though, didn't try to overplay his serve with the body serves. Survived until he found something special. Incredibly close final. Really enjoyed it, John.
Has he set a template? Has Struff set a template for these guys, especially if you're capable of it, of having good touches at the net and maybe being a bit more aggressive on the return?
A template, like a game plan? Do you mean?
Yeah, so for about 2 or 3 years ago,
Yeah.
there was suddenly this antidote to Medvedev template emerged. I think
Right.
it was probably Novak at Paris Bercy, in particular the serve volley. We saw a lot of serve volley from Carlos Indian Wells against Medvedev this year as well, although Medvedev has emerged from obviously the doldrums over the previous 12 months. But there have been certain players, not that they're figured out, because I think Carlos is not going anywhere, and he'll win more matches than he loses, even when someone is as effective as Struff was yesterday. But has Struff, is he said, look, this is the way to play Carlos, and the way you other guys, with the exception of probably Rusevori at the beginning of the tournament and Sinner in globally, if you like, as a bigger point, this is the way you guys have got to try and beat Carlos Alcaraz. And if that match happens 10 times, Struff wins 3, let's say, which is pretty good considering before the match it was like 90-10 in Carlos's favour as far as the bookmaker's concerned.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, John. I think the serve and volley as a weapon against Alcaraz consistently isn't really tenable. I think Struff made it look easy, relatively. That's not a game plan that just anybody can take into a match with Carlos, right? Keeping him off his rhythm, though, throwing it in every so often, absolutely. Not in the same way as Medvedev, where you would probably serve and volley most points if you were capable enough, right? Novak did that as well, Kyrgios. The return position, though, that is absolutely something that people should be taking notes on, because Rusev already did the same thing. Hug the baseline, take the return early, take the time away from Alcaraz. Jannik Sinner, one of the best players in the world at doing that, and will consistently be doing that against Alcaraz as their career develops. Maybe once the serve of Alcaraz gets a little better, that stops working. But for now, absolutely, it's a good move to use against him, John. Struff, I did not expect it from Struff at all. That's the thing that just keeps putting a smile on my face. That first return game was just like, oh my God, this guy's gonna make this very competitive.
He's bringing it. He's bringing it. He certainly brought it. So well done. My only sort of sadness, and I don't know if he was feeling this in the rawness afterwards, is that, he's 33. He's not been in a Masters 1000 final before. The probability, is maybe he won't be in one again. I just hope he can pick up maybe a 250 or 500, particularly during this little moment in his career where he's actually very capable on grass as well. And actually, one thing he said on Friday night, so this is just after his semi-final win over another surprise package at this tournament, Aslan Karatsev. He was asked, I think, and it may have been me, but I can't remember who it was, about, what are you going to do against Carlos? And he said, I haven't really thought about it. And then I said to him yesterday, you thought about it on Saturday, didn't you? You clearly had given it a lot of thought, which is great. But yeah, back to the thought of, 33 years old. He also said on Friday night as well, after his win over Karatsev, that, he was asked about the previous matches against Carlos, because it was 1-1. They had a match at Roland Garros about 2 years ago, I think it was, that he wasn't taking too much stock in. He won it in straight sets, but, Carlos then and Carlos now are very different. But he also was really sort of talking a lot about the Wimbledon match. And he kept saying, he must have mentioned it like 3 times, it was so intense. He kept saying it was so intense, this 5-set battle they had at Wimbledon last year, which unfortunately I didn't get to see. Did you see that match, by the way?
I did, yeah. Very, very close match. So you knew immediately it could have been close. I just wasn't sure how well it would have worked on a clay compared to grass,
Sure.
right? But yeah, knew that he had a chance of keeping it competitive for sure. Touching on what you were saying there about, could that have been his last chance to get a Masters? I think for Struff, well, now he leapfrogs Van de Zandschulp as the highest ranked player without a title on the tour,
Okay.
right? Same with ADF, Davidovich Fokina. He's probably thinking, can I win an ATP title before my career's over? And you were saying that. Could he pick up a 250? Could he pick up a 500? He had that final in Munich last year, but that's the only final of his career. He's been a bit more of a semi-final loser normally than a guy who makes final after final and loses. Obviously, Van de Zandschulp's now record is a lot more glaring because he's had those 4 championship points and he didn't quite make it.
Yeah.
I think Struff, if he puts himself in that position, will deliver, just given how he tends to play. It's just, you're right, he's running out of time. I think it could happen. For me, as a fan of him, I'd really like to see him do it. Fingers crossed for Struffi going forward.
Yeah. In German, they say Daumen drücken. So fingers crossed in English, Daumen, which is just to put your thumb inside, which is the same meaning. It means good luck. So Daumen drücken, Struff.
Daumen drücken, Struff. I like it. Okay, John. We'll close shop there. Quite a short one today, but yeah, I mean, I loved the tournament. It was really good. The 2-week format, of course, a bit different for us, and we had that challenger in between. Great stuff. And we've got a 2-week Rome as well, right? I'm pretty sure.
Much,
yeah.
I guess it's qualifying happening today, maybe?
It is, yeah, it is. So we'll be back in 2 weeks with an analysis of the final for that one as well. We'll also do a WTA Madrid final analysis, so look out for that. Egand Arena, of course, that was a fantastic final. And if you're on YouTube, like and subscribe, all that jazz, etc. Please go see John on Twitter at jsilk, see me on Twitter at ontheline_Jack. Thank you very much for coming on, John.
Thank you.
And we'll catch you next time on the Online Tennis Podcast. Cheers, guys.